You can all hear me. This is Vish here at Pureprofile. Firstly, thank you very much for taking the time out today to attend the webinar. This, of course, is about the Values Project that we've been working in collaboration with UWA with for about the past 2 or 3 years. That's something we're incredibly proud of and have had great success with on all the sessions we've done in person in both Sydney and Melbourne. And for those of you that didn't get a chance to attend those, we hope that you get some useful insights and information from this particular session. So without further ado, let me just run through some housekeeping first. Of course, the webinar is being recorded and we'll email a copy to everyone in attendance today. And then we'll set a time at the end for some questions and answers, if you have any, and that will come in the form of a chat box in the actual platform that we're presenting in. So hopefully that's all clear. So yes, the two main people involved in the Values Project are Professor Julie Lee and Dr. Ioana Evers. So they'll be running through the presentation today and taking the questions at the end. So without further ado, please go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Vish. Can you hear me okay before I start? Okay. I'm going to, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the partnership that we have with Pureprofile on this project. The University of Western Australia and Pureprofile have been working together for several years to better understand people's values. And okay, great, thank you. Someone just said they can hear me now, I feel better. So welcome everyone. I can see some friendly faces in the chat room and also some people I don't know yet. My name is Professor Julie Lee and I work at the University of Western Australia. I am the Director of the Centre for Human and Cultural Values, and Pureprofile is one of our key partners in the centre, and we've been working with them for several years to try and better understand people's values. I'm going to click, great, we have an agenda. So I'm going to talk about what values are and also give some insights on the values of Australians, the individual values of Australians. And then after I finish, Dr. Ioana Evers is going to talk about how values influence behaviour. Specifically in this webinar, we're going to talk about how people spend their time and money. So let me start off by talking about what values are. Values reflect what matters most in life. They're broad motivational goals that guide our attitudes and behaviours. Since we spend a lot of time trying to understand our customers, clients, and even our partners, trying to understand what they want, it's important to understand what matters to them most in life. For that matter, it's probably important for you to know about your own value priorities. But if we're not always consciously aware of our values, which we aren't, we have to think about how we can know what they are. It turns out that we can take a simple survey that asks us to consider which of a set of values is most and least important to us as guiding principles in life. If we ask about enough sets, as we do in our survey, we can come up with really high quality information about every individual's value priorities. This is important because unlike many other aspects of personality, values can't be easily seen or inferred from behaviour. People can do the same thing for very different reasons. Understanding values provide a window into why they do what they do. So knowing what people's underlying values are helps us to better communicate with them. And also knowing about our own values can help us make decisions that are right for us. Values reflect what matters most in life and give meaning to the things we do. This is a quote from Shalom Swartz. He's the inventor of the values theory I'm going to talk about, and he's been involved in this study at every point. He's been involved in helping us write the report, also in helping with the survey and interpretation of results, and so I really want to acknowledge him for doing that. So I'm going to talk about a set of near universal values, and when I do this, I want you to remember that they're all desirable. Not all values are virtues, which is the word that often comes in mind when people talk about values. But all of the values I'll talk about are good and worthy of pursuit. There are no bad values. This is why it's important to understand that there is a common set of values that we all share, but we all differ on what's most important to us, on our value priorities. And we also project our value priorities into others and judge their actions by our own values. And this makes it much harder to understand why people do what they do without knowing a little bit about values theory. So this is the near universal set of values shown here in a circle based on their underlying relations. Values that are next to each other in the circle, like power and achievement, for instance, share compatible motivations. And those that are opposing on the opposite side share conflicting motivations. So let's walk through just one of these contrasts so we're clear. For some, perhaps some of you, the most important goal in life will be the welfare of others. These are self-transcendence values. It could be benevolence, is the welfare of close others like family and friends, or universalism, which focuses on the welfare of all people, including equality and social justice, or on preserving the natural environment. To attain these goals, people need to prioritise the welfare of others over themselves. In contrast, other people place the most importance on achievement and power. To attain these goals, they need to put themselves and their own achievements ahead of others. These people need to be better than others in order to achieve or lead. Basically, you can't put yourself ahead of others and others ahead of yourself at the same time. They have incompatible motivations. If you prioritise one of these pedals, you'll find it difficult to understand and relate to people who prioritise the opposing petals. But if you do understand their priorities, you can understand where they're coming from and why they do what they do. So let's have a look at what values are most important to Australians. Just before I do, this is an example of one of the sets of values that we ask people to select what's most important to them and least important to them as guiding principles in their life. The survey has 21 sets, and it's really important to ask enough sets in order to get really good quality data. One of the things about values that's important to remember is that they're relative to each other. If you simply ask about values on a rating scale, you'll find that almost all of them are at least somewhat important to very important. And one of the important properties behind values is that if we take the position relative to other values, we get a much better idea of what leads behaviour. If you use a rating scale and you have the full set of values, you usually centre those values around the individual score to remove patterning bias and be able to compare across people. In this measure, the measure actually measures them as relative values, and people are knowing exactly what goes on behind the survey. Okay, so we measured values, and then we also measured a lot of other variables. We measured aspects of personality, traits and states, as well as a wide range of behaviours. As I said, Ioana's going to focus on how people's values influence the way they spend their time and money. For now, I'll describe the values in our sample. Okay. So this is a graph of the average sample's value priorities in blue and their perceptions of most Australians' values in grey. It's clear from this that they're amazingly similar. From our sample, we can infer that people prioritise benevolence, security, and universalism more than other values on average. As an aside, the security value became more important after events around 9/11 and the threat of terrorism that followed, and this hasn't really reduced very much. You might also notice that the least important values here are power and achievement. But interestingly, we think most Australians value power and achievement more than we do on average. One of the key measures that we used in our study was to look at what the most important value is to a person. So people prioritise very different values, and this slide shows the proportion of people in our sample who place the most importance on that particular value. Benevolence is clearly a winner here with 38% of our sample, remember that's 7,500 people, placing the most importance on benevolence. This is probably as we would expect it. Women and older people place more importance on benevolence, and younger and single people place less. You'll notice here that we've got some values that just have a small percentage of people, but it's important to know that even at 1%, we can look at 75 people in our sample. So we can still have a look at how people differ based on their most important value. Now I'd like to hand it over to Ioana to talk about how values influence our behaviour.
Thank you, Julie. In this part of the webinar, we'll go into our findings about how values relate to how people spend their time, both on a typical day on and a day at work and a typical day off, but also how they spend their money. So firstly, let me go into how people spend their time. So as Julie mentioned in the survey, everyone has 24 hours to spend per day. And so we ask on a work day, but also on a leisure day or a day off, how do you allocate your time across categories? So we asked people about 10 different categories of how you could spend your time, and we consolidated those into 4 different ways to spend their time. So we had work and education as one category of time spent. We had family and social time, personal leisure time, and also just necessary time you need for like sleeping and eating. So let's go into how values relate to how people spend their time. So I'll go around the circle. Basically, each of these are presented on the values circle or flower that Julie described before, and you'll see pluses and minuses where values were significantly related to time spent on that category. And so if we looked at what we would hypothesize about who people, their value priorities and who would spend more time at work and education activities, it's not a surprise to us that people who truly value and prioritize power and achievement would spend more time on these activities. And across the board, we found on a typical day off, people could be even more value expressive. So it's not surprising on a work day, people valuing power and achievement spend more time. But on a day off, there were even 2 more hours they would spend working or on their education. It's also unsurprising, and what we would hypothesize, the people who prioritize hedonism and stimulation might also spend less time on work and education activities. But I think what's interesting and what we'll see as we go across all the categories is that we see opposing relations on the opposite side of the circle. So for example, people who highly prioritize benevolence and universalism values spend significantly less time both on a typical work day and a day off at work and education. And as I mentioned before, of course, people only have 24 hours. We all have the same amount of time to spend. And so we can really see some clear value expression in how people spend their time. The same was true for the conservation values, conformity and tradition, that oppose the openness to change, hedonism and stimulation. They were spending more time, typically, at work and education. So then we see not quite the opposite relationships, but for family and social, if we start with what we would hypothesize, who would spend more time with their family and with their friends, it's quite clear that we would think people who are self-transcendent focused, valuing benevolence, universalism values, and also the conservation values. All of these values that we see from security all the way around to nature universalism would be classified as like social values. So all of these values are other related. Whereas from power all the way around to self-direction, these are more personal focused, values that are more about the self rather than others. So this is a clear trade-off we see. One half of the circle are positive related to spending more time with family and friends, while the other half of the circle is related to prioritizing those values, related to less time with family and friends. Personal leisure, again, what we would hypothesize here, we can see directly, and then what's also very interesting is that the opposing values have the opposite relationships, even if we wouldn't directly hypothesize that. So unsurprisingly, people who highly prioritize stimulation and self-direction spend a lot more time personal leisure. And the opposite is true, that people who are valuing tradition and conformity spend less time on leisure activities. And this was, again, both on work days and days off. So with each of these, I'm just going to quickly show this summary table, which is in the report. I definitely don't expect you to see all of this, but I want to draw your attention to it. In the report, we just kind of summarize how all the values relate to all the different categories that we've measured. And you can see broad patterns of how the values that neighbour each other and group together, that they're related in similar ways to the ways people spend their time. So now let's quickly spend a bit of time on how people spend their money. So unlike time, where we all have 24 hours, we all don't have the same amount of money to spend. So we had a number of options about how we could analyse this. The way we asked people this is we had categories from the Australian Bureau of Statistics consumer surveys about spend categories. And so we asked people just to put actually the amount of money in the last month that they spent on certain categories. So when we analysed this, we did it in a number of ways. One way was the proportion of spend. So for each person, we calculated the total spend and then had a percentage of spend per category. And the other way we analysed it is just the actual amount of money. So regardless of what you had altogether, we wanted to know how much more or less money you spend on different categories. In the report, we examine and report on the money spent, so we could actually say X amount of dollars was spent more or less if you prioritize certain values on certain categories. So let me explain that further. I'm only going to talk about a few of the categories because we measured 10 categories, and you'll see that in the report. So I've just highlighted a few here, and I definitely encourage you to go and look at the report for a lot more detail. So I'm going to start with recreation, as it kind of relates to leisure time spent that we just looked at. For recreation spend, as you can see here, and unsurprisingly, all the openness to change values related to more money spent on recreation. So unsurprisingly, if you highly prioritize hedonism, stimulation, self-direction, you're likely to spend more money on recreation activities. And we can see here that the opposite was true in conservation. So people prioritizing tradition and conformity spent relatively less money. And then we can see here benevolence as well. This is, of course, caring for the welfare of people close to you, your friends and family. They were also more likely to spend money on recreation, which again, kind of makes a lot of sense. So let me talk about a related category for some, alcohol, tobacco, and gambling. So people might relate this to recreation, and we can see here a very clear relationship, the opposing values of conservation and openness to change. And we see very clear relationships here with the spend. So those people in the top quartiles and people who are really prioritizing openness to change spend relatively more money in this category, and the opposite was true for the conservation values. To a different category entirely, housing. So let's look at, if we were to hypothesize about this, security and benevolence, even though they're not necessarily right next to each other, they're both social values, caring about other people. And you can see in different ways why both of these would motivate higher spend on housing. So of course, security, you might want to pick more safe suburbs, which might come at a premium. But also for benevolence, you're caring for like your family that you're living with. Again, it might relate to higher spend on housing. Then we see, of course, like achievement, hedonism, stimulation cluster there, relating to more spend. And the opposite is true with tradition, conformity, also relating to humility values, which might relate to a lesser spend. And then nature universalism, also related to a lower relative spend on housing. And finally, we were looking at donations to charity. This is always an interesting category. And so other research we've done, we can see that no matter what people's values are, they're happy to give money. It's more a case of who they would like to give money to, and maybe if they'd like to be recognized for it or not. But in this study, we basically just said, how much last month did you give to charity? And so here there is, of course, that social personal conflict or opposition. So on the personal side, you can see security, power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation related to relatively less money. People who prioritize those gave less to charity. And for those people who prioritized universalism values, benevolence, tradition, and remember that tradition often relates to people or can relate to people giving to religious organizations, all related to relatively more money given to charity. So I'm going to stop there with all the different categories, but you can see that we've got 10 categories that we report on. And again, this is just to show that across all the values, you can see where neighbouring and opposing values, they kind of group together and cluster in how the values relate to spend on money across categories. So this is just the beginning for us at Pureprofile with values, and it's really exciting like what we can now do with the insights that we've derived from understanding values and how we can then use that to get insight into our consumers and make better decisions, really understand consumer behaviour. Not only, of course, targeting consumers with products and services that are relevant for them, but messaging and framing according to people's values. We can do so much. So this is just the beginning of our journey into intelligently using values data. So I'm going to hand over both to Julie and Vish to talk a little bit about both the Centre for Human and Cultural Values and Pureprofile, and yeah, how we can help you do what you do. Over to you, Julie.
Thanks. So the Centre for Human and Cultural Values aims to foster research, and we're really interested in innovative interdisciplinary research that expands knowledge about values, but also about other issues in society. And consumer behaviour is certainly one of the top priorities for us. We also look at children's values and how we can better promote children's well-being. We look at organisational values. We're interested.
If anyone else can hear you, Julie.
Oh, can't hear me? Can anyone say yes if they can hear me? Oh, great. Okay, thanks very much. I can got lots of I can hear. Yep. So we're developing partnerships with industry, and as I said, Pureprofile is one of our key partners. We have been working on a linkage grant with them that was funded by the Australian Research Council, and we also provide training in values for researchers, educators, and for organisations. Bish, would you like to talk about Pureprofile?
Thank you, Julie. I won't spend too much time on this slide because most of the people on the call know, I guess, what we offer. So aside from project management and obviously the survey programming, the interesting piece here is around the panel piece, because we are now able to append this values data to any project that we see fit. So if you are interested in perhaps pursuing a research project and appending some values data on the back end, that is something we are now able to offer, and offer pretty quickly. Turnaround time is pretty quick, and obviously dependent on the type of study that you're running, it can provide obviously some very useful insights that can add a bit of value to your research project. So please do get in touch with us, and if you haven't done the values project yourself, you can please go ahead and access the values website. I found it incredibly interesting to see what my own values were. So definitely, I urge you guys to do the same. You might be surprised or not. I certainly was surprised by some of the values, but it was incredibly interesting nevertheless. So I think with that in mind, I think we're going to end with some Q&A from the audience. So I'll hand back over to Julie and Ioana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bish. So I encourage any of you who are listening now, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, and Julie and I will endeavour to answer them. While I've got you there, I've just got the slide about you can download the full report. So please do go online if you haven't already. It's over 100 pages of beautiful report. We've tried to be really clear in our findings, and we've just scratched the surface today of what we've found. So please do go ahead and download that report. So let's just jump straight into the Q&A. So I'll read out the questions, and then both Julie and I will answer them. So to start with, Peter Joy asks, are values geographic? So in other words, do we live in places among people who share our personal values? That is a really good question, Peter. So Julie, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, absolutely. We do share values in a society, but culture, for instance, only accounts for about 15% of the variance in values, and individuals' differences in values accounts for 85%. In the report, we do note that there are patterns of values that correlate with or relate to socio-demographic groupings. For instance, males find self-direction, achievement, power, all more important than females, and females in general find benevolence. Younger people tend to promote all those open to change values like self-direction, stimulation, hedonism, achievement, and older people, it tends to be more security and benevolence. We do find that religious people tend to prioritise the conservation values, especially tradition values. So we do find consistencies in the social groups that we may interact with on a daily basis. But I don't know if any of you have kids, because we do a lot of work with children. And what I anecdotally note the most in families is that children tend to have very different values from each other, even within the same the same family. And so we know that life events, for instance, influence our values, and whether that people's values change in times of crisis, for instance, like the death in a family. And so we do see that people experience the same event in very different ways. So while there is some shared patterns among people who are with each other, very familiar with each other, we also find the full range of values. Ioana? Ioana, are you there?
Yes, sorry, I was just trying to work out the next question. I think that answered it perfectly. So, Peter, if you have a follow-up question, please feel free to type that in. But I think that really did answer that well. So we've got then another question about how our values and how we measure values relate to Roy Morgan's value segments. And so I might start with this one. From as far as I know, with the Roy Morgan values, they've not used the same theory. So for us, we're using Schwartz theory of values. There's some overlap. So you can see with there's like a status quo kind of old and familiar and tradition aspect of Roy Morgan's values. And on the other side of that spectrum is like new and different innovation. So you can see here it maps on a little bit to our then conservation, openness to change values. But then they've got individualism, expectations about quality, life satisfaction, and some of those things, well, I think some of these things are not even values necessarily, like expectations about price. So I think they've got some things about values, and it would be more on our conservation, openness to change dimension that Julie's discussed and defined really well. But other than that, they've added in other things that are non-values to make these segments. So there is some overlap, I guess, in answer to your question, but they're not then we're not talking really exactly about the same values.
Maybe I could just have a quick word as well. Is that okay?
So there's another question. There's a question about costs, and I'll leave that for Vish later, and we could certainly address that after, if that's fine. Then we've got a question from Dan Young. What generational differences did we observe? So, for example, between millennials and baby boomers, are millennials more benevolent? So I might just start there and then I can hand over to Julie as well. So we didn't analyse it in this report in terms of generations in the way of millennials, Generation X, baby boomers, but we definitely plan to do this in the future with life stages, because this is overall what we plan to do with this project. But in very brief answer, and I'll let Julie go on after, it's a bit the opposite. So millennials are not more benevolent. Certainly boomers or older people in our sample had higher proportions of people who valued benevolence. So let me pass on to Julie and she can elaborate more on that.
Yeah, I think we are having a look at that at the moment with the categories, but we prefer just to look at age, and age is almost linear on many of the values. So values like self-direction, stimulation, hedonism, even achievement and power are higher in younger populations, and then they go down in relative importance as people get older. Whereas security, conformity, and tradition go up. And it's probably not surprising. Benevolence actually, benevolence is also goes up, but we find people that with children, people with lower levels of education tend to be more benevolent as well. I guess it's sort of a complex picture. The one that seems to have less relation with age, although we do find younger people prioritise it more, is self-direction, which is sort of interesting. People who are really self-directed in life, it looks like they keep that priority.
Thank you, Julie.
Hello? Yep.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So I guess the next thing, Peter Joy has a follow-up question about that. Let me just read out Peter Joy's question. So he says, I was thinking specifically in terms of regional towns, are there really clusters of people with particular values or attracted by different values? So for example, is there any evidence that people who choose to live in Sydney or metro areas have different values to those who choose to live in orange or more regional and rural areas?
We haven't looked at that specifically in our sample, Peter, but I can tell you that in the European Social Survey, we've looked at regions and we see some regional differences. The regional differences that we see tend to be based on whether or not the communities are more or less religious, but it's certainly something we can have a look at and get back to you.
All right, we have another follow-up. Dan Young says he suspects there's a relationship between values and then drivers, or when you fulfill certain values and goals. So, for example, someone might value power less as they get older because they might have fulfilled that value already. Julie, what do you say to that comment?
I think yes, it's certainly possible, but and we do see people switch their emphasis in life. But I think we've found that changes in values associated with major life events are fairly coherent. So if someone becomes less power related, they become more benevolent universalism. We can see the changes go on in the whole circumplex. But fulfillment's interesting. Values, if I think about my values are very strongly self-direction, for instance. That's probably a core value for me. And I can't satisfy my self-direction values. If people challenge it and try to control what I do, I actually get an emotional reaction. It's part of what values are. They're beliefs tied to emotions. So if someone tries to tell me what to do, I can feel goosebumps, for instance, on my arms. I have an unreasonable reaction to that. And I think these really deep, fundamental core values, they can be maybe satisfied at particular times when they become less important and other values become more important. They have to be salient for the situation. But what we're talking about is those really deeply held values that people have. And I think just by fulfilling them, I don't think the value goes away.
Thanks, Julie. I think
what I can say, though, just really briefly, is that we do feel good and better when we fulfill our own values. We do feel good, we feel better, and we can see higher levels of well-being for people who are able to fulfill their own values.
Thanks, Julie. Anyone else who's listening, are there any more questions?
Can I just say there is one slide there's one slide that I didn't put up, and I probably should have. It's really interesting. So this slide, I know it's quite difficult to read, but it's also in the report. What we did is we broke people into groups based on their most important value. So if you have a look, first of all, down at this column, this is overall in our sample. This was perceptions of other people's values. So people in our sample perceived that Australians place the most important on security, benevolence, and hedonism, and the least on power, tradition, and achievement. But if you have a look at the self-direction values, for instance, you'll see self-direction is the second most important for people who value self-direction. In blue is highlighted the value that they perceive their own value to be important to other Australians. And what I really wanted to take away from this was the fact that we do think other people value the same things as us.
I think we've got time for one last question. So I'm going to take the question from Alan Pommering. are values culturally specific, or are they not really more than their age and cohort specific? So Julie, shall I pass that to you?
Yeah, I think certainly this set of values that we work with is, and I was going to answer this a little bit compared to other types of value measures. The set of values we work with is a universal set of values, and both the structure, the relationships between values, and the relevance of the values have been supported in hundreds of studies in over 80 countries. And what's significant about this theory is it proposes the relationships between all values. So when the value survey is done in China or Russia or Poland or Indonesia, we still find the same patterns of relations. So first of all, I want to say that it's a universal theory of values. Secondly, is it culturally specific? Well, we have primes constantly in society. And in Australia, the primes that we have are often around self-direction type primes. If you look at the Australian values statement, it says that we believe in equality and social justice. We should conform to rules. There's certain values that are primed more in society. We think of ourselves as an egalitarian society. So you'll find, for instance, that societal universalism is more prevalent on average in Australia than it is, say, in China, where we find more tradition and conformity values are primed. So this is actually used in a slightly different format of the specific values to depict cultural values as well as depicting individual values. Does that answer the question?
I think it answers the question perfectly. Thank you so much, Julie. So that's all we have time for today's webinar. And so we really love to thank everyone for being a part of it and taking time to come and learn more about values and listen to us. So there are a few questions we didn't get to. So we're going to email you all the recording. We'll also address those questions we didn't quite get to answer. And in the meantime, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to send them through and we'll try and address them all when we contact you all. So once again, thank you so much for being part of today's webinar and hopefully we'll speak to you all soon. Thank you all.